In a recent 60 Minutes interview, Pope Francis sparked controversy when he claimed that humans are fundamentally good. Katelyn Beaty joins Phil and I to discuss the Pope's comments and why our theology needs to include both the doctrine that all humans are made in the image of God and an understanding of original sin. Also, new survey data suggests that the religious nones have plateaued, and religious affiliation among Gen Z is on the rise. We discuss why this might be happening and how the weirdness of Christianity is what makes it appealing to so many people right now. Then Skye sits down with Sean McGever to discuss his new book, Ownership, the Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitfield. They explore how these three historical evangelical leaders navigated the morality of slavery and the lasting impact it is still having on the church today. Plus, even priests are not immune to Florida man syndrome. Sean McGever is not just our guest today, but his book is also our selection for this quarter's Holy Post Plus book club. All Holy Post Plus subscribers at $10 a month and above will receive a free digital copy of Sean's book. And later in June, we will have a live stream with Sean where our Holy Post Plus members will get to ask him their questions. This is just one benefit of joining Holy Post Plus, along with ad-free episodes, bonus interviews, and episodes of Skye Pod and Getting Schooled by Katelyn Chess. You can sign up and become a Holy Post Plus subscriber today at holypost.com/Patreon. Here is episode 619.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I am here with Katelyn Chess. Hi, Katelyn.
Hi, Phil.
And I'm also here with Katelyn Not Chess, otherwise known as Katelyn Beaty. Hi, Katelyn Beaty.
Hi, Phil Vischer. Thanks for having me back.
Skye, thanks for coming back. Katelyn Not Chess. We've done this before, and it's a little confusing because I have a hard time directing my questions to a particular co-host.
Yeah, you can't even say like
the same name.
Katelyn C and Katelyn K, you know.
No. It's
yeah.
There's
Katelyn,
only a 2-letter difference between the Katelyns. Yeah. So yeah, it's a little
Katelyn
confusing.
I and Katelyn E.
Right.
That's all we've got. And I'm not even sure that you guys can figure that out on the fly.
No, it would take me a minute. Yeah.
Skye is not with us. He is in Israel. Skye is on pilgrimage. At this point, he is climbing the Via Dolorosa on his knees, which I think is what you do when you go on pilgrimage. No, he's sending us back pictures that he's taking and ideas for stories he wants to pull out of his trip to Israel for future Holy Post content. And now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Katelyn.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode is sponsored by World Relief, the Christian humanitarian organization that we trust to tackle the challenges at the border and around the world. Do you know how World Relief got its start? During the Second World War, folks at the historic Park Street Church in Boston, Massachusetts, took up a special offering during the Lenten season to provide for the needs of people displaced by the fighting in Europe. 80 years later, that spirit of generosity still lives on in World Relief. The compassionate men and women of Park Street Church decided not to settle for just doing church. They decided to be the church. They lived and left a legacy. Do you want this to be your story too? Check out The Path, World Relief's monthly giving community, to learn more about how your partnership can create lasting change. Katelyn wants to have some fun. Katelyn with an E.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not going to do news of the butt, because then both of you would just look at me in disgust. So I'm not going to do that, because I just don't want that. I don't want that pressure.
I think you might get that anyway.
We're going to do animal news. Italian island overrun.
Good.
Hey, I'm trying to read the headline here. Italian island overrun by goats is offering them free to anyone who can catch them.
Aww.
Would either of the Katelyns like a goat? Katelyn, do you have room for a goat?
No. I think I have room for like a fish and maybe a cat, you know?
Okay.
But in theory, if I had more space, I'd be open to a goat, a free goat. But
yeah, a free goat.
I also feel that goats maybe have a bad reputation as being evil. You know.
Yeah.
Like, you know, guys. Matthew 25.
Not in the farming community. Not in the farming community.
No, I think that even beyond the Bible.
Yeah.
I think goats are kind of ornery creatures.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, they're fun at petting zoos.
They're cute.
My kids love petting goats and hugging goats and having goats nibble on their shirts. That's fun. That is just fun. Aww. Okay. The tiny remote Italian island of Alicudi is home. I'm going to say all the Italian words wrong. Is home to only around 100 residents and ideally about 100 wild goats. But this year there are 6 times that many. 100 residents, 600 wild goats. And that's too many goats. And they're not even supposed to be there. They were brought by a farmer about 20 years ago. There are no native goats on the island. And the farmer decided to let them free. And now it's just a goat free-for-all on the island. So the mayor of Alicudi started a program where if you can get to the island, which means you need a boat, that's the only way to get to the island. If you have a boat and can get to a small remote Italian island, you can fill your boat with as many goats as you want. And they would prefer that you don't eat the goats, but they're not going to ask any questions.
Yeah, you can also eat goats. Phil, if you can say the name of this island correctly, you'll win a free trip to the island.
Alicudi? I don't know.
Katelyn, what are your take? What's your take on the goat island?
Well, I think we're skipping too quickly over the catch it part. That seems really important.
Yeah, you got to catch the goat.
That you can catch it. Because I'm fairly confident I couldn't. I have a friend who just got some chickens and I didn't even want to try to catch one of them. I was too scared. I don't think I could catch a goat.
I think chickens are less wild about the idea of you touching them than goats, because they want to leave a few goats on the island just so that tourists can pose with them for pictures. So apparently,
so they might be easy to catch.
Apparently, it is not hard to approach the goats.
Okay.
Yeah, you just say selfie, and the goat comes up to you and smiles.
How do they do on a boat, though?
How do they do on a boat? Goat
yeah, I'm just imagining.
It's a children's book.
Is it hard to keep them in the boat?
What you find out after you get your free goat. They're not going to tell you before. Okay. That's any sermon illustration ideas from either of you? Sheep and the goats? Come on,
God rejoices over one wild goat caught by a tourist.
And
then over the 99.
That's so much nicer than what I was going to say, which was more about the farmer that brought them thought one little sin just is fine. But all of a sudden you have an island full of goats.
Yeah. That's really good.
Taking over.
We need
That's
positive applications and negative applications.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I just wouldn't have expected it would be Katelyn Shess who would bring the negative
I
application.
know. I was thinking the same. We're totally tracking, Phil. I anything about like judgment, sin, corruption. Like that's usually my beat.
Yeah. And cynicism, that's Skye.
Yeah.
Not Katelyn.
But we gotta switch it up a little bit,
Yeah, we gotta switch it up a little bit. Hey, where'd my I think my mouse just died. Well, that's fun. Dead mouse. I don't need that mouse anyway. We'll just do a mouseless show. I'll use a free goat instead. Pope Francis draws accusations of, we talked a little bit about the Catholic Church last week because of the nuns of Saint Benedictine, of Saint Scholastica, of whatever else they had in their name. And
we just want to apologize
discussing.
in advance to any Catholic listeners.
Italians, Catholics.
There's
Sorry.
a theme here.
Sorry. Pope Francis draws accusations of heresy for claiming humans are fundamentally good. Did you hear about this?
I did.
His interview on 60 Minutes. Pope Francis drew scorn and accusations of heresy on social media for maintaining during his recent 60 Minutes interview that the human heart is fundamentally good. Interviewer Nora O'Donnell asked him this question at the end of the interview: what gives you hope? And this was Pope Francis's response that has become controversial. He said, everything. You see tragedies, but you also see so many beautiful things. You see heroic mothers, heroic men, men who have hopes and dreams, women who look to the future. That gives me a lot of hope. People want to live. People forge ahead. And people are fundamentally good. We are all fundamentally good. Yes, there are some rogues and sinners, but the heart is good. And that made a lot of people go, well, wait a minute. What? Wait. What did he say? So some people have said, well, maybe that's a difference in Catholic doctrine that we just don't understand. Obviously, he doesn't appear to be a Calvinist. But, immediately my upbringing is saying, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, how are just some of us rogues and sinners? And Proverbs, the heart is deceitful above all things, who can trust it? So how can we say the heart is good?
Yes,
I'm not
Phil,
even
we're
sure what
familiar
to do
with
with
the
this.
doctrine of sin. We've had it drilled into us from a very early age.
Wow. Wow, Katelyn. I seem to have hit a nerve, Katelyn.
It's my sin nature coming out.
Uh-huh.
I want to get
I
to
thought you were fundamentally good, Katelyn.
Nope. I want to get to the theological dimensions of this conversation, but first I just want to say this felt like very easy bait for people who have other reasons to be upset with the Pope.
Okay.
It felt
that's
like, what's one way to kind of shore up your credentials or your credibility among like a certain very online wing of like the Christian internet is to like dunk on Pope Francis, right? Like to retweet what he said and to be like, actually this. And it was not coincidental that several like conservative, either like political or cultural talking heads jumped on this to kind of take him down. And it's like, I you might have a good theological point, but I don't necessarily trust that your motives in this moment are just about theological purity. I think it's also about signaling something, right? As most of us do in some capacity on the internet.
Okay. There's that. In fact, the Christian Post wrote about the piece and quoted heavily from the Babylon Bee and the Daily Wire. So there's that. But still, Katelyn's, I'm just going to say Katelyn's, and you guys have to figure out who I'm talking to.
Do it.
It did seem a little questionable.
I agree with the internet people who had criticisms of this. And I agree also with what Katelyn said of there are other motivations for making a big fuss about this.
Yeah.
I actually, though, the thing that I think is most interesting about this is first that, there's translation questions happening here. Like, he wasn't giving this answer in English, so I am curious how much we're really getting correctly from this. Like, fundamentally good means something to me in English that I'm not sure is what he meant. I can't know that with certainty. And what words you're emphasizing in this response really matters, right? So on some level, I think a lot of people online are saying, hey, there have been certain corners of maybe reformed evangelicalism that have way overemphasized sin and have forgotten the created goodness of humans. And that's how we would read this response. And if that's what was intended, then agree very much with that. But then there's this other response that has been people saying, like, well, you can't expect the Pope to be Calvinist. He's the Pope. He's Catholic. And it's like, well, no, as you said, Phil, we have from the very beginning of the church, one of our earliest fights, right, was just like, is sin something that impacts all humans? Or are we able by our own will to just live good lives? Right. And for the most part, the Christian tradition sided on, no, like everyone receives a sin nature at birth and we are not able to save ourselves and we are reliant upon Christ to make us new. But all of that aside, I think the most interesting thing about this that I am very critical of this response for, but I didn't see a lot of online, was the fact that this answer was to the question, what gives you hope? Like, I'm more bothered by what gives you hope being people are good and good people are doing good things. And even somewhere in there, he says, like, you know, people are looking to the future and trying to do good. And on some level, I understand that giving you hope. But I just recently heard a person give a speech very similarly, where they were like talking about church decline and lack of affiliation and attendance in the church. And they said, like, we can do this. Like, it's going to be okay because we'll just do some new programs and we'll, you know, reimagine church and the whole time I just kept thinking, like, that is so depressing to me. Like, if my ultimate hope is in people getting their act together and doing good things and having great plans for the future, I feel pretty depressed as just a person who experiences fallen humans all the time, and as a person who's studied a good amount of Christian history and honestly doesn't have a lot of hope in us to pull things around and really kind of do something good in the future. I wish that, and this is not true of, I'm sure Pope Francis agrees with what I'm about to say, but I just wish that Christians were less afraid in our public lives to say our ultimate hope is in the return of Christ to make all things new. Sometimes we're nervous about saying that because it feels overly supernatural. Sometimes we're nervous about saying that because Christians have said that to justify political inaction or isolation. But I wish instead we said, well, I'm drawing on the tradition of the civil rights movement, on abolitionists who said Christ is coming back to redeem and restore all things. That's where my ultimate hope is in. And because I have that hope, I can seek justice, I can show mercy, I can try and make systemic changes in my communities, because I'm not placing all my hope on just humans being good and better and trying new things in the future. I'm placing my hope on, I am doing work that will ultimately be vindicated by the God who will create justice, even if I cannot. And so that's the part of it that's the weirdest to me, is like, this is a strange answer to what gives you hope. Yeah.
Now I'm going to speak completely out of ignorance. Okay. And you
just
guys can tell me. Oh,
it was too easy. I'm sorry. There was this wide open door. How could I not walk through it?
Oh, Katelyn. The South American Catholic Church, birthplace of liberation theology, Catholic liberation theology. Do we know how much that influenced Francis growing up in Argentina? And is there just more of a humanistic bent of people improving their situation in South American Catholicism that is catching the rest of the world now off guard? Like, oh, wait, where did that come from? Possible?
I've said this before. I get nervous when we talk about Catholicism because, maybe Katelyn knows way more than I think that she knows. But no one on the show thus far has known a lot about Catholicism. But
speak out of your great learning. You've read so many books.
I have read a lot of liberation theology. And I would say in some level what you're saying might be true. But part of what surprises me in his answer is actually that a lot of liberation theologians have a very negative view of the possibility of humans getting their act together. Like, a lot of liberation theology is like, the power of evil and the powers and principalities in the world have impacted economic and political systems, and the possibility of us overthrowing them seems limited. And that doesn't mean we can't do all of this good work. Like liberation theology, even just that word comes from God is a liberating God, starting with the Exodus and continuing out throughout the story of Scripture. And God is still a liberating God today. But that's a real emphasis on God liberating us from systems that we are both impacted by and contribute to. So there could be something here, but I also, this is part of my frustration with the folks online even who said, the Pope is on the side of a more humane, more just Christianity that says actually humans are really naturally fundamentally good. And I wanted to say, I don't know. I don't think that actually represents the Christianity that you think it does. I think it's actually a real gift of Christianity, not to say what the perverted version of this has been, which is you're a rotten worm and you have no sense of self-worth and you know, that's a bad version of it. But the gift of the Christian doctrine of depravity, of original sin is like we do have language to describe the depth of evil and brokenness in the world and the way that it can function systemically in the world. And liberation theology describes that really colorfully. I am sure that Pope Francis agrees with all of this, but I do think the fight that happened online missed both sides of it. Like one side picked this up in a way that I don't think he meant. The other side responded with, no, that's absolutely not true, in a way that I don't think he meant either.
Yeah. I mean, the doctrine of sin has a lot of explanatory power on both like the personal and systemic level.
Yeah.
Right.
Now,
Right.
I don't want to go on record as like being a Pelagian because I'm not.
Hey,
this was the
you're speaking on record.
This was the aforementioned doctrinal dispute in the early church. We decided on nope, humans are born. Every human is born with a sin nature. When Pope Francis said the heart itself is good, I kind of want to, now I think his saying and prefacing that by saying, yes, there are some rogues and sinners. That does not help us at all. As if we can just kind of locate sin in those like, just there's a few bad apples out there. And they cause all these problems, but most of us are not like I think that's utterly wrong, both theologically and just like from an evidential standpoint. Like this is clearly not truth. But do we want to preserve a sense that God created the human heart to be good? Like, I wonder if some of the defense of Pope Francis from the more Protestant, post-Protestant world is like, look, it was hammered into me from a very young age that my heart is bad. Like, at the core of myself is rot. And how do you develop? It's hard for most people to develop a sense of belovedness in parallel with that teaching. So I do think we have to be careful pastorally about how we talk about human sin and our sin nature.
Yeah, and there have been different points in history where, you know, like the Wild West was a moral cesspool, and then traveling preachers, you know, rode their horses across the West, calling people to repentance and telling them they were, you know, and that's where the fire and brimstone kind of came into the settings where people were just acting lawlessly in certain situations and needed to be called into repentance. But there are kind of different moods at different times for what the emphasis needs to be on. And the, you know, sinner in the hands of an angry God may have been really effective in the First Great Awakening, but then I don't know. Again, I'm talking out of ignorance. So that's twice in one episode. Wow, that's a new record.
No, but that's Phil, that's really helpful, because I do think there's this other thing that happens where we can map this debate, I think, unfairly, this particular instance of like what did Pope Francis say and is it good or bad? We can map that onto like the conservative folks were really like, no, you know, humans are really bad and evil. And then the progressive side of Christianity was like, no, he's so right. Humans are fundamentally good. But it doesn't just work that way. Like, to your point, there's moments when someone needs to hear, no, actually, Genesis 1 comes before Genesis 3. You are created good. There is a fall and it impacts you, but first you are created good. Sometimes it's the conservative folks who grew up in churches that said you're nothing but a rotten worm that need to hear, no, you are beloved by God, made in God's image, and that's what's first true of you. And then your experience the world tells you that you're fundamentally, like, there's something just like turned. There's something corrupted, and you try to do good, and then you find out you're not doing that, and you want to love people, and you do it in wrong ways, and there's something that just needs to be fixed outside of your will to just make good choices. But then there's even folks on the progressive side that sometimes have overemphasized the depth of depravity in our communities and systemically, and if you are on the wrong side of history, you're on the side of the oppressor, you're irredeemable. And some of those folks need to hear, no, actually, all humans created good in God's image and can be redeemed, and forgiveness is a good thing, and there needs to be reconciliation. So it's not just like we do this with all kinds of things. We just map it onto, there's the conservative side and there's the progressive side of this theological issue. And instead, to your point, Phil, it's like a pastoral thing of discerning where is the overemphasis, where does there need to be correction, and both quote unquote sides of the theological spectrum need to hear both of these truths, sometimes in different ways, systemic versus individual, etc. Need to hear these two true things that impact a lot of our theology.
And when people say, wait a minute, you're changing the gospel message because of a shift in emphasis, usually what they're saying is, I preferred the emphasis that I grew up with, you know, in that period. Or I've been reading heavily from this period, and I like the emphasis in this period, and that must have been the original emphasis. Because that's as far back as I've gone in my reading.
You're saying we like people who agree with us, generally.
Yeah.
Sounds like you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm moving on. So the Pope, we think he's do we think he is trying to offset something that he thinks is harmful and, you know, maybe doesn't see how this is going to be translated into another cultural context and then interpreted as heresy when he was just trying to balance a teeter-totter that he sees in his own head, maybe? I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, but I'm also like, that's a little out there, dude.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that the representative of God for millions and millions of people over the world would have confidence, even on 60 Minutes, to articulate like a distinctly Christian anthropology. And at the same time, if I were called up, always available to be on 60 Minutes for an interview, I'm sure that I would struggle to publicly articulate the traditional Christian doctrine of sin in a way that doesn't sound judgmental, dour, mean, all the things. Like, I'm not making an excuse for the Pope. I'm just saying, I wonder if some of this is about context, the medium, the setting. Yeah. How do you talk about human depravity in a pluralistic context?
Do you know who I think we need to ask about their opinion on his statements? I think we need to ask the sisters, the Benedictine sisters of Saint Scholastica, because they seem to have it together. They seem to have a good handle on historic Catholic doctrine in the context of modern America, and they can tell us what's up. You like?
I think that's a good idea.
We get them on the show.
Oh, I would love that. I thought you were going to ask Phil if we thought the Pope was infallible, and I was going to be like, well, I think for the most part, no. I think this is a crowd that's not necessarily into the infallibility of the Pope.
No,
partly infallible. I'm not sure what that means. Okay, I'm moving on. Ryan Burge just put out a piece because there's new data. We have new data, and nobody gets more excited about new data than Ryan Burge. It's like Christmas every time the new General Social Survey comes out. And the new General Social Survey, which is like 25,000 respondents in America, just came out in actually this month. And so he dove in and he's pointing out something interesting. He's wondering if we've talked about the rise of the nuns, not the Benedictine sisters, but the unaffiliated Americans, which has been increasing for decades, much to our consternation, much to the Christian world's consternation. Katelyn Shess is losing sleep over it. She has nightmares about nuns, not the Benedictine sisters.
I think that was a horror movie that came out a few years ago called The Nun.
Yeah.
It should have been the NONE.
Yeah,
Coming to terrorize your evangelical.
Absolutely.
Coming to terrorize Wheaton, Illinois.
According to the latest data, it appears that the rise of the nuns may have plateaued and may no longer be rising. In 2008, the share of Americans who were non-religious in the cooperative elections study was 21%. 5 years later, it had increased to 30%, 9 points in 5 years. And then since 2013, by 2020, so 7 years later, it was at 34%. That was kind of the peak, although it went up a couple. 2021, it was 36, 2022, 35, and 2023, 36 again. So for the past 5 years, it has been roughly statistically flat. And as he dives into the data, this is where it also gets interesting. Where it is continuing to rise is among the oldest Americans.
The silent generation?
Yeah, where it has, and the generation under that, where
the
it
boomers?
has... Yeah.
I'm just naming the names of different generations.
Well, this is a
Gen
really
X?
fun game, Katelyn.
Millennials?
Try again. Where it has plateaued and even decreased is in the youngest generations. That's weird. So among Gen X, 34% were nuns in 2020, and it's exactly the same in 2023. Among millennials, it was 43% in 2020, and it's down a point to 42% in 2023. Among Gen Z, it was 45% in 2020, 48% in 2022, and now it's all the way back down to 42% in 2023. A whole bunch of Gen Zers just decided they were no longer religiously unaffiliated last year. What's that all about? Katelyn, yes, it does no good whatsoever. Katelyn Beaty, you're in New York every day out on the street interviewing people, doing your man on the street report, woman on the street report. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
What do you make of it? Do you have any thoughts, Katelyn Beaty?
I don't have any analysis, but I do want to note two things before we dive into our armchair analysis.
Okay.
I mean, of course I have thoughts, but Ryan Burge is the person to really kind of delve into this with.
We don't have him on the show this week, Katelyn Beaty, so we're going to have to do the best we can. So
a couple thoughts. It is interesting to note that the number or percentage of nuns, generationally appears to only be rising in the silent generation. And I think it's important to remember that the nun affiliation doesn't mean, it doesn't mean atheist or even agnostic. I think of it as almost a posture of the category of religion, religious belief and observance doesn't factor into my daily life and identity in any which way. And so then I think about, well, what is happening in the oldest generation in terms of their community, church context? Is this a matter of losing those ties and connections to more traditional faith communities because people tend to lose those kinds of ties when they get older, and maybe this rise of the nuns in the older generation isn't really theological. It's just like life has taken me away from various institutions, including religious institutions. The other thing I'll say is like the headlines that are like Gen Z rejects God, totally simplistic, silly, and also the data is telling us not true. Like, it seems to be there has been a slight bump in religious affiliation among Gen Z. I just, it has been the case for a long time that sloppy news media will basically be like, younger people don't like the church. And it's just, it's much more complicated than that.
Right. Other Katelyn, help us out.
I appreciate both of the things that Katelyn said. Especially, I still have this like image imprinted in my mind of a conference that I was at that Ryan Burge was talking about the nuns at, and it was him and Tara Isabel Burton, and it was like Ryan Burge was like numbers, 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 and Tara was like the world is full of magic and people have questions, and like it was just such a stark difference both in approach. Like here's someone who just like numbers explain the world, and here's someone who like write novels and is a theologian and thinks very differently. But also part of the interesting thing about their conversation was he is looking at the numbers, which can tell you many things, but they can't tell you everything. And sometimes they can actually mislead you, and they can make you feel in a world that we have grown up in that tells us that like numbers and science, this is what really tells you about reality. We can overread into these. And one of the things that happened in that conversation was Tara, elaborating on the point Katelyn was just making of nuns is not just encapsulating all of these different people, but so many of these categories are just kind of flimsy. Like they don't necessarily capture well what people are experiencing. I have some friends who just recently met someone who moved to our area, which is in North Carolina. She moved to North Carolina from the San Francisco area, Muslim woman. And it was because she was like, I want to be around religious people. I'm sick of being around people who are derisive about religion. I don't even care if it's not my religion. Like, I just want to be around more religious people, younger women. And I say that just to say, like, yes, the numbers can tell us a lot of things. This is very interesting. But also some of these individual stories can tell us things, which is that some of it's not about just affiliation and institution. Some of that is coming out of a place of going, I want to be around people who act like there's more to the world than we have been told there is. And I might not be sure exactly what tradition I want to land in. I might not be sure what religion can tell me about what's happening beyond the material world. But I want to be in communities of people that don't just feel like this is all there is, which can be really depressing, and also you can feel the constraints of that for accurately describing how the world works. Even going back to our previous conversation about sin, I have been in conversations with people at Duke who are like very quote unquote secular, might consider themselves atheists or agnostics, but when they look around at the political sphere, they're like, it just seems like I need spiritual language to describe what's happening here. And I'm sick of the categories I've been given because they don't seem to really capture the depth of depravity. They don't seem to capture how captivated people are by certain ideologies. So part of what's interesting to me about this is the way that I think younger people are coming up against the real loss that happens, either with loss of institutions, we're lonelier, we're disconnected, we're spending more time online, but also what real loss there is in losing language to describe our experience of the world that is never just going to be numbers, material science stuff. And that could give some explanation for why it's teetering. This number is kind of plateauing, but most of us aren't seeing our churches just like suddenly filled with Gen Z people.
Yeah. I do also wonder if you checked the none of the above box, how much of that was saying, not that I've given up on religion, but I don't want to be associated with any of those groups of people. Yeah. And if, over the last 5 years, some younger people have found a group they are willing to be associated with. So if it's just more about, I've found a tribe, I found a group online, or I found a podcast that I like, so now I think I am associated with a religious group. Do you know how much data I have to support my theory? None, but I'm pretty sure it's rock solid. 0% data.
Yeah.
Beaty, anything?
Yeah, to underscore something that I think Katelyn was just articulating, and that her mention of Tara Burton reminded me of. Just because we might be post-religious in the sense of affiliation with formal religious institutions does not mean we are post-spiritual, and it certainly doesn't mean we are now in like a godless era. Or there are so many buzzy descriptors of like the age that we're in, a secular age, Charles Taylor. And then there have been all these like Christian spin-offs that are not as good. But I think we are...
Isn't that always the case? Like, our spin-offs just aren't quite as good as the original.
like coming up on like 20 years ago when I was like freshly out of college and the new atheists were all the rage. And it felt like, oh, I guess this is the trajectory we're on, this kind of hardened, virulent materialism. I would say prejudicial, like they're, you know, we have seen that a lot of the new atheist spokesmen also harbor some pretty either nationalistic or racially charged views. That era just feels like of a totally different time. You know, there are so many niches, whether that is like yoga or plant-based medicine, like the explosion of interest in psychedelics, or even more banal things like, you know, a community group where we do rituals together. I feel like all of this speaks to a deep desire for like a spiritual backbone or spiritual ritual, even if people they no longer have like the tried and true containers to kind of give them the language for it.
Right. Right.
So in that regard, I just feel like scary headlines about the rise of the nuns don't actually capture the spiritual inclinations of a lot of the people being surveyed and may formally kind of say, yeah, I'm a nun. I have no affiliation in particular. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in God, faith, spirituality, the divine, however you want to call it.
And when you know, Justin Brierley has his new podcast and he's calling into question, is Christianity actually on the rise?
I think it is in the UK, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Is
in other places
that there's a difference between attitudes towards Christianity in the UK, where it never became so beholden to one political party or one political identity, you know, where the Church of England, it's conservative on some things, it pushes for reform and progress on other things, you know, because it's kind of captive to the state. It can't really be captive to anything else to a certain extent. And in the US, we now associate the church, quote unquote, which is a ridiculously overbroad characterization, with conservative politics. And it's harder for people who've walked away from it to turn and walk back. You think I'm onto something? Should I write a book, Katelyn Beaty? My new book?
No, the last time I was on, I asked you about writing a book and you said no.
Oh.
Is the Lord working on your heart?
Now I have an idea that I think could be really hot seller and could get me on probably in the New York Times.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the goal, baby.
Wow.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Send me your pitch. Is it like...
Katelyn, what do you see as the... Katelyn, sheesh. Katelyn's, what do you see as the difference between UK and the US that might lead to more intellectual rebirth of Christianity in the UK? Shess first.
I don't know enough about it. This always makes me nervous. When we talk about Catholicism, it makes me nervous. When we talk about the Church of England, it makes me nervous because their whole history of church-state relations.
Okay, so we can't talk about anything except Liberty University, Dallas Theological Seminary, and Duke Divinity School. That's what we can talk about.
We can talk about the whole United States. Oh. No, I do think what you just described is true, and that there is something very different happening there than here. I don't think what we should take from that is like there's one trajectory of relationship between the church and state that is better or makes more sense or works for the church. I do think what we can learn from some of the stuff Justin Brierley is doing is, and this goes back to what Katelyn and I were both saying earlier, is, and I've said this on the show before, but like leaning into the weirdness of Christianity. Like too often in the States, we have been responding to, and this is a little bit true there as well, but we've been responding to the new atheist kind of concerns. We've had apologetics ministries. We've had very logical. I mean, even when you first brought up this study, I thought, oh yeah, the conversations I have had with folks at Duke that are in those older two generations do tend to be, what's the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? When I'm talking to like the college students at Duke,
couldn't care less.
No one cares about that. They're like, a man rose from the dead? I don't know. Sure. Like weird stuff happens in the world. But we have been so trained to think the way that we approach, especially like secular people, but especially atheistic, agnostic folks, is like give the logical arguments. And I think instead it should be, here is this like really wild story, and it's captivating and it's strange, and like let's not kind of, I mean, I remember hearing this when I was in youth group, was like, wait to get to the weird stuff till you've got them hooked with the stuff that makes more sense. And it's like, I don't know, maybe just throw in the weird stuff. Lead with the weird stuff. Yeah. And even in the way that Justin Brierley is making that show is like, maybe that was the real downfall of the New Atheists. Like I said before, it was like they just not only misogynistic, racist, like all sorts of other things, but also could not actually describe the world as we experience it as humans.
Yes.
And one of the benefits of Christianity is not only that we have weird stuff that I think is really true and beautiful, but that some of the weirdest stuff we have explains something of the human experience that other things can't explain.
Right.
How do we explain Balaam's ass? We said we weren't going to do news.
That's a good one to lead
butt.
with.
Yeah, right. How do we explain anyone's
Katelyn.
ass? I don't know. Okay, let me wrap it up. So we need more weird. How about this? Florida.
Keep Christianity weird. I mean, I know it's hard being from Austin or Portland or whatever, but like, isn't that what? I could really start preaching, but isn't that what makes Christian faith interesting? And I'm not saying I'm a Christian because I find it interesting conceptually. Like, obviously there's a deep heart and emotional, and there's a connection to things that have happened in my life where I would point to as like the evidence of a good God working in my, so there are all sorts of, but one of the reasons I find Christianity compelling to this day from an intellectual perspective is like, could anybody have just like come up with this? It seems like no.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. In the last word, in the name of keeping Christianity weird, tell me if this is on the right track. Florida priest charged for biting the arm of a woman he says was desecrating the Eucharist.
I mean, who among us?
Is that weird?
Who among us?
Okay. This is a fascinating story, and we're not going to talk about it very long because we're out of time, but it was on my list. A woman came in, hadn't been to church in years. Her nephew or niece was being, whatever, they were being baptized, I think. So she, yes, I was consecrated.
They call them baptisms in the Catholic Church.
Yes, they're baptisms, right. See,
that's something
Katelyn
we have in common.
Yes, it is. I'm very sorry. And then she went up for communion, and the priest asked her, when was the last time you did confession? Because as we know, and this is something I do know about the Catholic Church, they do not practice open communion. You actually have to be Catholic.
I literally just typed in Florida priest, and the first search term was bites. so this is a she was quoted after the conflict saying, "I just wanted a cookie." That was her. So she came up, asked for the cookie. He said, "Have you given confession recently?" She said, "That's none of your business." He said, "I cannot give you the host." She put her hand in the plate and just started grabbing a handful of the cookies. He didn't know what to do. The host was being violated, so he bit her arm.
That was not the only option.
That was the only option. Now he's been charged with battery. He was just defending the host.
He was charged with, he could be charged with battery.
No, he just was. He was charged with 1 count of battery.
I mean, this is probably...
Is that weird enough?
Is regionalist. I don't know if that's a term, but it's a little easy to slot this into like Florida man syndrome. It affects the priests as well.
Florida priest.
And then I think a Bible was involved in some way as well, which, hits all the...
Weird in Bible.
We don't need to discuss that. I just thought it was really, really, really fun.
But Phil, that's a very important point of like, it's not just the weirdness. It's like, it needs to be Jesus weirdness, not your own brand of weirdness.
Important note of clarification. Don't be weird for its own sake.
Yeah, I was thinking the use of poisonous snakes would really pull in Gen Zers back to the church because it's so weird. Okay. Katelyn Beaty, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
You still enjoying the work? Still putting out great books?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a glowing endorsement. Okay.
It's bizarre how I can work all week, like 40 hours a week on very specific books. And then when people ask me, like, what are you working on? I'm like, I have no idea. I cannot remember what I was just editing. No, I truly, I did just finish developmental editing for Beth Allison Barr's next book.
Oh, cool.
Which will be out next spring.
Do you think we can get her back on the show to talk about it?
Definitely.
Okay.
It is about the role of the pastor's wife as like a very specific gendered cultural role that she's arguing from a historical perspective, like replaced ordination as a woman's pathway into ministry.
Interesting. Oh, no one will oppose that premise at all.
No one's going to be mad about that.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with more fun. Thanks to both the Katelyns, and thanks for all your support out there. Check out new stuff on Holy Post Plus and Katelyn's show. Curiously Katelyn. I almost was like, both Katelyns have a show. And other Katelyn's show, Saved by the City. By the City.
Yeah.
I always forget. Yeah, okay. Saved by the City, Katelyn Beaty, Curiously Katelyn, Katelyn Chess. Phil does whatever Phil does. I don't know what Phil does. And we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
This episode is being sponsored by BetterHelp. When I was a younger man, I did not know how to handle stress. I tended to bottle it up, and it came out in really negative ways. For me, it manifested with physical heart palpitations. But through that experience, I learned healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with stress. And one of the better ways is by talking to someone you can trust. Therapy is a safe place to get things off your chest and to figure out a healthy way of dealing with your stress. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. So learn how to get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/holypost today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/holypost.
In recent years, there has been more and more debate about how Christians should handle the teachings of theologians and preachers Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and George Whitfield. All three men played a significant role in the First Great Awakening and are considered some of the fathers of evangelicalism. But all three men were also slaveholders, and in some cases explicitly advocated for slavery. That is why Skye was so excited to sit down with Sean McGever to discuss his new book, Ownership: The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitfield. They talk about Edwards's, Wesley's, and Whitfield's compromised relationship with slavery, and how prioritizing what they thought was the mission of the church led them to ignore the suffering around them, and how that tendency is something that we still see today. Here is Skye's interview with Sean McGever.
Sean McGever, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you, Skye.
I'm delighted that we're using your book, Ownership: The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitfield as our selection for this quarter for the Holy Post Book Club. So those of you listening who are part of Holy Post Plus will be getting your copies shortly, either digitally or hard copies. Let's start with this. I'm a history nerd. I was a history major as an undergrad. You're clearly into history. There's probably people who don't really know who Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, or George Whitfield were. So briefly describe, I mean, it's hard, but briefly describe who they were and why they're so important to American evangelicalism.
Yeah, that's great, because maybe some of these, names are familiar. Others you're like, I think I should know who they are, but I'm not quite sure. So yeah, let me give you a real intro. These three people, if you want to know where evangelicalism came from, the history of it, you're curious about its background, you have to know about these three people. If you ask any historian, anyone that knows a bit about evangelicalism, these are the people. So John Wesley, most notably known as the founder of Methodism. So if you've heard of Methodism, obviously it's a lot in the news today, but its scope is branched out, not just in like the United Methodist Church today, but massive appeal. If you look back into like the holiness movement, it spread into like modern Pentecostalism and that massive influence it has on the world today. Anyway, when you think of John Wesley, think of Methodism. he was wild because he preached a lot. He hundreds of thousands of miles on horseback. I think he preached 44,000 sermons, which equaled out for, over the course of his 54-year ministry, 3 sermons a day. So anyway, the guy was wild and left an incredible legacy that a lot of us know. So John Wesley, the George Whitfield is another person, and he joined the Holy Club. I know it's the Holy Post. Here's the Holy Club at Oxford, which was Charles and John Wesley were the primary leaders of, and he is known as the first transatlantic Christian celebrity, which is kind of interesting. And he was an evangelist and traveled back and forth 13 times across the Atlantic to be able to preach the gospel in colonial America and England. He was one of Tim Keller's favorite evangelists, and just really notable for when you think Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, and just lots of people coming to revivals and things like that. You need to think of George Whitfield. So he's the second person to think of when it comes to these early evangelicalism in my book. And then Jonathan Edwards, some of your listeners will know that he's known as America's greatest theologian, perhaps greatest philosopher. A lot of people have run into him maybe in a high school class, and his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which isn't necessarily the most notable thing about him, but that's kind of the most well-known thing about him. One person that really brought him to light is John Piper. John Piper has over and over talked about how Edwards' theology, philosophy, teaching about like our desires and our urge for wanting, like Christian hedonism kind of comes from this idea of wanting the thing that would our greatest end, which is God. And so John Piper has really popularized him. But yeah, one of the things about these 3 guys is Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley were born in the same year, 1703. So they provide a really interesting snapshot for my book and the way that evangelicalism kind of originated, because they start in the same year, but in different countries. John Wesley in England, Jonathan Edwards in colonial America, in New England. And so that's kind of where the story of my book begins, and really where evangelicalism begins. And Whitfield is about a decade after them, almost like their little brother. And he's the one that goes back and forth across the Atlantic. So you have these 3 people. They all play an important part of not only the story of evangelicalism, but the story about my book, which is about slavery.
Okay, so you mentioned that Edwards is in the colonies, Wesley is in England, and Whitfield went back and forth between the two. And in the book, you point out, this is from page 32, you say, our historical and geographic locatedness profoundly influences our decision-making, including our Christian decision-making. So talk about how their locatedness, both geographically and historically, shaped the way these 3 men thought about slavery.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for highlighting it. Yeah, there's a really interesting story that goes with their historical locatedness. Like you said, obviously it's the years that they're born, but also where they were born. One of the things that I did for my book was I looked at the ancestors of Wesley, Whitfield, and Edwards, and I saw, where did they live? Who are their influences? This sort of thing. And so when we find Edwards, I'll focus on Edwards for a moment. When we find him in New England, in Connecticut, in New Jersey and such. But when we find him in kind of New England, he finds himself a couple generations in as a colonial American. But when you go back to his grandparents and his great-grandparents, they all come from, not a shocker, but from England. The same kind of like era of their Edward's parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, because Wesley was also born in the same year, and Whitfield isn't too far off from that. All of their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents are about the same age and come from the same kind of theological and Christian background. So they're all part of the Church of England in one way or another. Whether it might be the Puritan side or more the classical side, what have you, they have the same theological background. And what you see is that they're reading the same types of theologians. They have the same church tradition, but some people go across the Atlantic. And they're bringing those going across the Atlantic, while there's some differences with Puritanism and things like that. When they get across the Atlantic, where they live makes a big difference. But their foundational documents, obviously the Bible, but also their church documents, their ecclesial documents are very similar. And so you see these play out in two different countries with the nature of what's happening there. And so one of the things that I like to highlight is that quickly, if you are in colonial America, there's a good chance that you are going to take this concept of how the Bible teaches between a master and a servant, and as enslaved people become available and perhaps needed, not actually needed, but they perceive it as folks needed, they will see this master-slave relationship that's explained in the Bible as something that is appropriated to enslave people. Meanwhile, in England, they'll have the same kind of theological basis for the way that they read master slave language in the Bible, and they will hire servants. And so what you see there is essentially the way that this applies is if you're in America, there's a high likelihood, if you're a person of power and of resource, that you'll enslave people. Meanwhile, if you're in England, if you're a person of power and resource and you're a Christian, you're going to hire servants. And so that's one of the things. Basically, where you live largely influences how you might participate or not participate in slavery in that era.
One of the interesting things throughout the book is that Wesley, Edwards, and Whitfield all throughout their lives appeared to oppose the slave trade, but they didn't oppose slavery itself. How did they split that hair? Like, why were they opposed to the trade of slaves, but somehow justified, at least two of the three of them, actually enslaving people themselves? What justification or rationale did they give for that nuance?
Yeah, and you do see a little bit of movement in Edwards because the first person that he enslaves, he knows very well that her name is Venus, or she was named Venus, came from participating as traded in the slave trade. Later, and it's a recent discovery when we get his letter on slavery, his draft letter on slavery, which was never published, but we found it. King Minkama found it. He rejects that. So it does seem like, just really quickly, in Edwards, he initially at least participates in the slave trade, but later writes against what he sees as unjust acquisition of slaves. But you're right. At the end of the day, Edwards and Whitfield do participate in enslaving people, while they see that there is limits on the way that you could enslave people. And they get these. I mean, they're not the first ones to, think about this. I have a chapter where I describe what are the English attitudes, English Christians coming from England, towards slavery at a snapshot of around the year 1700. And the third of six of the points that I make about understandings about slavery is slavery acquisition within limits. And so there's a big difference. In fact, there's a really underemphasized difference. Like, this is missed in a lot of literature and some of the blind peer review and stuff that my book got said. I'm really glad that you brought this to light. The difference is this. Is it the management of slavery, or is it the institution of slavery that we're talking about here? And as it turns out, most Christians, at least English Christians around the year 1700 and prior to that, were understanding the Bible as a document that helps us understand how to manage the institution of slavery rather than abolish the institution of slavery. So it's management versus abolish it. So how is your question, how is it that they understood that it could put limits on acquisition or abolish it?
Well, it just seems kind of like I said, hair splitting when they say it's fine to enslave people if you treat them well. But the process of enslaving people, that's bad. You shouldn't go to Africa and kidnap people and enslave them. But once they're enslaved, yeah, okay, that's fine. And it just seems bizarre that they would be so outspoken against capturing people through what they consider to be illegal means, but keeping them captured is okay. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the ethical gymnastics you have to go through to land on that kind of position is weird. But let me go a little bit deeper. Two of the great strengths of evangelicalism, both contemporary and historical, is its insistence on the centrality of the Bible, the biblicism, as as the quadrilateral would have it, Bennington's quadrilateral biblicism. And the second thing, another one, is the emphasis on the centrality of the mission of the gospel, of evangelizing the lost. Let's talk about how each of those contributed to the way this generation in the 18th century thought about slavery, starting with the Bible. All three of these characters, at one point or another, justify slavery, as you just said, because the Bible seems to say there is slavery and it never outlaws it. Talk about some of the arguments that they used from Scripture to justify the enslavement of other people. And then an additional question, like when Wesley, very late in his life, came out against slavery and wrote against slavery, he doesn't actually build a biblical argument against slavery. And I'm curious on your thoughts as to why he doesn't use the Bible when so many other abolitionists did. Just what was their overall view of the role of the Bible in this whole issue of slavery?
Yeah. In many ways, they didn't talk about the role of the Bible in the issue of slavery. When you look at, like, for instance, John Wesley has a commentary on the Old Testament and New Testament. When you look at the passages that are verses that talk about enslaving people, he really kind of glosses over them. When it comes to Edwards, when you look through, he has so many sermons and things like that, and I've discussed this with other Edwards scholars, he doesn't really talk directly about how, what we would look for. What does he say explicitly about slavery? Whitfield, he really mostly left us sermons, and there's some letters and things like that. He does have a prominent letter that criticizes what he sees as unjust and violent treatment of enslaved people. So we have that. But as far as like maybe I hate to say it this way, but a positive, here's what the Bible teaches about that we can enslave people, and here's a clear exposition on the scriptures about slavery, they don't do that. They don't address it directly. In fact, what we have from Edwards is a draft letter that never came to light and is like on scraps of paper. So when it comes to what is their, clear articulation of what they see on these passages that a lot of us might be curious about, we don't have that, except for when they see like what they understand is unjust treatment of enslaved people. So they take it for granted, or they assume that the Bible teaches that slavery is appropriate. And to your point about Wesley, when he comes out in 1774 with his thoughts upon slavery, he makes it explicit that he is going to not utilize the Bible, but instead he's going to use natural law and philosophy to be able to create this argument to motivate people. And it's an argument from, silence, which I don't want to make, but I think if I was to just stick my neck out a little bit, I think he didn't really want to navigate that. I think that would have been trickier. I think he goes to something that he thinks that more people will accept. So actually we have a huge silence on how they understood the slavery text and what the Bible teaches about that, except for unjust, violent treatment. And to your point a moment ago about the slave trade, there is, a passage that, we should reject slave trade. So that is explicitly rejected in the Bible. So when Edwards and others say, okay, yeah, we should reject trading of slaves, there's a clear, I believe it's 1 Timothy that talks about not participating in that. So if there's something that they do with the Bible, they just take it as assume that this is a positive good, that it's a reality in our world, but here's how to manage it. And that's kind of what they encounter. And to your point, when Wesley wants to write against it, he doesn't use the Bible, which is shocking because the document, which he's mostly borrowing from Anthony Benezet, has more Bible in it. There's a Quaker that has a whole bunch more Bible and a sermon in his document that Wesley's pulling from. And Wesley removes the biblical content and the sermon from it and kind of gets rid of the Bible and presents a history and a natural law argument to against slavery.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that one of the besetting, something we've inherited in modern evangelicalism is, yes, the centrality of the Bible, but also generally a rather unnuanced way of reading it. And the argument is, well, the Bible says slaves obey your masters, so therefore slavery is justified and acceptable in the Bible. And it seems like these 18th century Christian leaders, these evangelical leaders, kind of had that approach. Well, it's okay to have slaves in the Bible, so it's okay to have slaves today, and all that matters is that you treat them well. And they don't really go any deeper. And it's fascinating that there are even contemporary Christian leaders like like John MacArthur and Doug Wilson, who are still arguing slavery is okay because it's in the Bible. And that lack of nuance and depth of thought about the topic, because you just take the ink on the page at face value, is kind of stunning. But let me go one step further on this biblical idea. Throughout your book, you cite a number of places where these three figures all talk about slavery as, some call it a necessary evil. I think it was Jonathan Edwards' son who talked about it as distasteful, but to be endured as human folly, I think was his quote. But there was this general attitude in the 18th century that slavery is not ideal. It's not what ultimately God wants for humanity. It's not going to exist in a redeemed world or in heaven. But God just kind of winks at it. And okay, yeah, you can do it because it's permissible. But by the time you get to the Civil War generation, a century or more later, the attitude towards slavery has shifted from just, at least in the Confederate South, has shifted from a necessary evil that God tolerates to an actual God-ordained virtue, that slavery is how God wants the world to be organized. Curious, you don't go into this in a great depth in the book, but a little bit towards the end. How did the legacies of Edwards and Whitfield and Wesley contribute to that shift toward the Confederacy seeing slavery not just as a necessary evil to be tolerated, but a virtuous good to be defended?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, they don't leave, Whitfield and Edwards don't leave a lot of information. Their practices tell us what they believe about it. They don't leave a lot of documentation other than what they see as maybe the proper treatment of enslaved people. Wesley, on the other hand, is the one that stands up in 1774 and finally speaks out. And generally speaking, he dies, 17 years later in 1791. He also goes quiet in a bit, even after he comes out to speak up against slavery. But it's a little bit like too little, too late about the legacy with Wesley. And it's really tragic because Methodism is growing in America significantly. And toward the end of his life, he is advising his leaders in America what to do. And if there's a priority for Methodism and evangelicals, it's evangelism. So anytime they encounter pushback from plantations, in particular, if the Methodist preachers wanted to reach out to everyone in a certain area, and in colonial America, this would include a lot of plantations. Then they needed the permission of the plantation owner, and they were first off seen as dangerous because if the enslaved people, the thought was this, there's really no grounding for this, but the thought was if the enslaved people became Christians, that they would somehow be emancipated or they would want to claim, authority for their freedom from God. And so the Methodist evangelists would make deals with the plantation owners to say, well, look, we won't talk about freedom. We won't talk about any of that sort of thing. We just want to give them the simple gospel message that they can be right with God. And that's about it. And then we'll get out of town and leave them. So there was this compromise that happened. Some of the folks in colonial America started threatening the lives of the Methodist preachers, saying, we don't really even want you here anyway. And so they kept backpedaling on what really Wesley wanted to say. And since Wesley didn't leave like strong biblical arguments, he left other kinds of arguments. I feel like they, for a really long time, didn't have any rationale about how to counter this. And so to answer your question, when we get up to the Civil War in the 1860s, there's really not at least from the people that I'm talking about, from this strain of evangelicals, Wesley, Whitfield, and Edwards, they're not providing the type of material to meet the information that Christians would need to be able to look at their Bibles, and to be able to like reject slavery in a comprehensive way. And one really good resource for that would be Mark Noll's books. There's his first one, the Civil War as a theological crisis. And then he has a more recent one, America's Book, that covers all this. And really, as it turns out, to simplify Martin Noll's arguments in there, the simple, straightforward reading of the Bible leads a reader to think that slavery is the norm. Meanwhile, the arguments against slavery require nuance, take more time, a bit more complicated. And because of that, they're just not as successful for the large populace, for most people. Yeah.
Okay. So, we've covered kind of the Bible piece of it and the lack of nuance and how we read it. And you've touched a little bit, and I want to go deeper now on the mission side of it. You mentioned how the goal, the primary mission for the Methodists was converting the lost, spreading the gospel. And whenever there was a conflict between advancing that mission and combating slavery, they basically folded on slavery and said, well, we gotta convert souls. We gotta plant churches. We gotta spread the gospel. And you have a number of scenes in the book that really illustrate that in a really gross kind of way. So one was, you talk about some of the plantations in the Caribbean, like Barbados, where the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, this evangelistic society, had plantations. Talk about how the economic necessity of those plantations led them to enslave people, and what they actually did in the name of the propagation of the gospel that was awfully hypocritical.
Yeah, I mean, the anecdote that I share in there is just absolutely terrible. And so the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, which continues in different forms today, obviously starts with a great goal, as many of us do, best intention, evangelism. So that's at the heart of their mission, and that's something that I affirm and is great. What happened as they grew was that they, like many groups, will inherit resources. So the Codrington plantation, he was a wealthy landowner. He donated his assets to this organization so he could further their mission. Well, as it turns out, the assets that he owned included plantation, which came with it enslaved people. So by inheritance, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel inherited plantations, which also came with enslaved people. The society then determined, well, this is, they're in England, they're participating, many people are participating in the transatlantic slave trade. They don't question this. They see it as an opportunity for funds and also evangelism. Okay, great. Let's send down missionaries to the Codrington plantation, and we will evangelize the enslaved people, which was already something that they were doing. But it's just, tragic isn't even the right word. Shocking, just evil. The anecdote that I share is it just sounds awful to say, but they put on their chests, they brand on their chests the word society of the enslaved people. And I just can't imagine. This may be a good question for us today. To what lengths will we go in the name of evangelism to do evil? And I'm an evangelist. Like I do this sort of thing. What sort of either compromises am I willing to make that I know that I'm willing to make in the name of sharing the good news of Jesus, which I'm highly committed to, or God protect me from the type of compromises that I don't know that I'm making as I attempt to share the good news of Jesus. Anyway, they brand folks with the word society, which they would have known as like Society for the Proclamation of the Gospel, or on their chest. As it turns out, over many years, none of the enslaved people accept Christianity. Shocker. And so, yeah, this is the sort of like blindness that people who care a lot about evangelism, which I don't doubt at all that they do, will kind of get themselves into and then be scratching their heads wondering why the good news isn't landing with people.
Yeah, that anecdote and another one that you share about Whitfield. So Whitfield comes to the colonies, is doing evangelistic preaching, but his passion is to help orphans. And in Georgia, he establishes an orphanage. And in short order, he realizes that the economic sustainability of that orphanage depends on enslaving people to work the land and create enough revenue to keep the orphanage going. And at one point, his orphanage is housing, I think it's 16 children, but he's enslaved 50 people on this plantation in order to supply the funding to care for 16 orphans. And whether it's that or the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel literally burning the name of their ministry into the chests of enslaved people, like those things, we look at 200 years removed, 250 years removed from those things and go, oh, how awful. But then you think about contemporary stories of churches, denominations, mega churches, camps, Christian camps, who give the argument that they cover up sexual abuse, they cover up church abuse, they cover up all kinds of injustice, all in the name of, well, it's for the gospel. It's because we're evangelizing. It's because we have to reach the lost. It's because it would set back our ministry if these stories got out. And you realize, wow, we've inherited that same blind spot where we are willing to sacrifice our sisters and brothers in the name of the mission of the gospel. And that's where I felt your book was really powerful, because whether it's the way we read scripture in a really unnuanced and flat way, or the way we so prioritize the mission that we turn a blind eye to the suffering of people, including those that we inflict suffering upon. And like those same tendencies are still part of the American evangelical church to this day. They manifest themselves differently, but they're still there. And it's just kind of stunning to see that. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about what do we do with all this? And towards the end of the book, you unpack the lessons to be learned, not just in the way we think about these three kind of founding father figures of American evangelicalism, but the way we think about ourselves. So take us there before we wrap up. You warn against sort of hero worship and making any of these historic figures into untouchable, saints that have no flaws in their character or theology. But what does that mean for us today? And how do you take what these men, their blind spots, and apply them to our own circumstances?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, and so much of it is just like difficult. But it's important to lean into the pain and the confusion on that. Yeah. A couple takeaways. One is, personally, I'm a person committed to, evangelism. I think that's really important. In the vein of being an evangelical, which I identify in some ways and in some modern ways, not so much, but caring a lot about people hearing about the good news of Jesus is something. With evangelicalism, there comes an incredible temptation to feel like we are the ones that have control over the eternal destiny of another person. And with that plays perfectly into a problem with power. Thinking that I have this power over you. If I tell you these next words, your eternal destiny hinges on it. If I don't tell you these words, your eternal destiny. That's an incredibly tempting power dynamic that we need to be aware of. And for myself, who's multiple decades in sharing the good news, I need to be, notice that as I do that my power over you, and it can be used as an excuse for evil. You gave a bunch of modern anecdotes of probably groups that are committed to evangelism and sharing the good news, who also put up with all sorts of things that are evil and should be stopped right away. So how do we reckon with that? One, and I do this in chapter 8 and chapter 9 about the role that the Quakers played in Wesley's life, and then also when he speaks up. So I'm just going to kind of fold these in together in chapter 8 and 9. The first thing that he did was he listened to people who were directly impacted by the topic. So in this case, he listened to people who were enslaved. So listening to people that have been hurt, to listening to people who have criticisms. So listening to people. Also listening to outside voices. It was really strange that Wesley listened to Quakers. They were not an esteemed group. They were a fringe group. They had views that even Wesley didn't think were consistent with Orthodox Christianity. Yet he was still willing to listen to some of their arguments just because he rejected some really important premises of the way that they worshiped. He was willing to listen to them on other topics and hear them out. So the first step is listening to people who are directly impacted, in his case, enslaved people. Second, maybe listen to their advocates, even if they're on the fringe or outside of what you normally think is orthodox. Another step would be to read the writings of their primary voices. So that's what Wesley did. He came into contact with this book by Anthony Benezet and some other folks. He informed himself. So listening, reading. Another thing that he did was he looked outside of his geographical context. So, I'm an American here. I'm an American evangelical. We're not the only Christians in the world. How is it that other people in Christendom and outside are looking at us? This is one of the things that he did as Wesley is in England, and he's seeing how Methodism is advancing in America. He's getting reports in a different context and hearing those dynamics. So he's listening kind of to an outside geographical voice. So I think that's important because I think I've heard someone say that culture is kind of like the secondhand smoke that we breathe. We don't even know all the things that we have when we breathe it in. So listening to someone who's not in that, and then recognizing that there's a good chance that your theology, your outlook on life, your outlook on God, it has changed in the past, and it probably will change in the future. And I know that feels really dissettling. That feels like I don't want to be a person that changes my thoughts about my life, my values, about my theology. But if you're to be honest, many of us, if you look back, okay, do I believe exactly the same thing I did 20 years ago? No, I've changed, grow in different ways. Is there a chance that if I was 20 years from now, there's going to be some things change? So recognize that we're all navigating and things probably will change. And then I would encourage people, they do feel that they see something that is out of line, that they speak up. And that takes an incredible amount of courage and often comes at a cost, as it did for some of these Christians. And it just propagated because it didn't end quick with 1800. Obviously, we're still dealing with it today, but obviously manifests itself in the Civil War as well.
Yeah, I'm grateful for the lengthy explanation you gave of Wesley's later years. I mean, he lived decades longer than either Whitfield or Edwards. And I wonder if that added time brought humility and curiosity. As you said, he engaged with Quakers and people outside of his faith tradition. And it gave me hope that as we get older, as we get wiser, as we become more humble, we're open to change. And I also have to believe that his location in England meant that he was less economically dependent on slave ownership for his well-being, unlike Whitfield and Edwards. And Upton Sinclair famously said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Oh, and wow. Again, I look at some of what's going on in the contemporary American church, and there are some people who are in ministry leadership roles or just part of the larger economic realities and political realities of America. And it's really hard to get them to understand things when understanding it would cost them significantly, not just economically, but in status or community or something else. And I think as Wesley got older, he was less prone to be subject to those things and more open to change. And so his courage, his curiosity, his humility, his willingness to look beyond his own tradition, engage broadly, listen, all of that brought him to a place that neither Edwards nor Whitfield had the time or ability to get to. Reminder for all of us that we need to engage broadly. Sean, thank you so much for the book. As I said before, I love history. I loved reading this. I think our Holy Post audience is really going to enjoy it and give them some historical context for the ongoing struggle we have with race in the church and in our country, but also hopefully bring us all to a point of realizing, hey, we can be guilty of these same blind spots in different ways. So I look forward to interacting with more of our audience about this. We're going to do a live stream to talk more about the book. So as you guys read it and engage it, be sure to write down your own questions and send them in. And Sean, look forward to interacting with you more about it, hopefully on that live stream as well. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Skye. Appreciate it.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.